Welcome to another episode of Cheers Dears. Today we are joined by Amanda Desiree, the author of Smithy, which was a wonderful, very spooky novel, and so excited to talk to her tonight. And Amanda, welcome to Cheers Dears.
Thank you so much. I'm very glad to be here.
I have the pleasure of getting to read your story, Smithy, which starts as a very interesting science experiment in the 1970s to teach a chimp how to do basic American Sign Language, among other forms of communication. And then something starts to go a little unexpected as the experiment progresses. So would you like to tell our watchers and listeners a little bit more about it?
Certainly. My book was inspired by some of the real life research with primates and sign language that occurred in the 1970s. I was also inspired by some real life hauntings. Some of the incidents that our experimenters encounter in the book resemble hauntings. For instance, there are a number of accidents that occur throughout the mansion where they're staying and where they're teaching their chimpanzee, whose name in the book is Smithy. And Smithy himself seems to behave very strangely. Occasionally, he will be speaking, signing to someone that no one else can see, or describing someone that no one else can see. And eventually the experimenters begin to wonder if there is a presence that only Smithy can see and that he can actually talk to.
And it's so interesting to see the progression of the scientists or the people who are with him as well, from blaming him for so many different things that are happening to that scene where they're finally confronted with, the place that you're in is haunted. Do you not know about this? And it was just so fun to see their digression as they start to question things, and, the anger and blame and fear start to come out. It's really very interesting progression of their characters.
Thank you. I did want to keep the situation somewhat ambiguous. A lot of the mischief that occurs in the house are things that a chimp could do. Again, I did quite a bit of research into some of the primate language experiments of the 1970s, and reading about some of the exploits of these animals was very eye-opening. So I tried to create situations where the chimpanzee could be responsible, and perhaps he is, or perhaps there's a different explanation. But presenting this legend about the house being haunted throws in a different variable. It makes the researchers consider something outside the norm, something that a lot of them are resistant to, although, as you mentioned, various characters become more open-minded as the story progresses. And some of the characters themselves experience situations that they believe to be supernatural. Again, I try to strive for some level of ambiguity where a reader could attribute the situations to either a natural explanation or imagination or wishful thinking or the paranormal.
And one of the things that was really interesting about your book was the actual format, where it's a compilation of articles, journals, and notes between the different people involved in the science, and also videos, descriptions of videos that were taken. And at first I was like, oh, this is kind of different. But as I kept reading it, I became more and more involved in it. And it was just such an extraordinary journey to have a multi-perspective adventure through this story. It made me think of like a Paranormal Activity movie, or something where you're an observer outside of the movie or outside of the book. And it was really a fascinating way to read this story as it went along.
Well, thank you. I have seen reviews that describe it as a found footage book, and I'm amused by it. I had wanted to create a story that would feel realistic, and using documents and video seemed to be the best way to do that, to create a situation where it seemed as though this was something that could actually happen or that had actually happened. Although there is a tradition in horror of having these epistolary novels where the story is told through documents. Dracula is the most famous example, where the story is told through diaries and letters and newspaper clippings. So I wanted to try to recapture that format for a more modern setting.
I did think of Dracula as I was going along. I think that was a really nice nod towards that as well. And, you started talking about how a lot of elements and scenes were inspired by things that had happened or actual paranormal events or the research that you had done. But what was it originally that sparked the idea for this story?
The inspiration came from two sources that happened in conjunction with each other. I had been watching a documentary called Project Nim about a chimpanzee called Nim Chimpsky, who was one of the first primates to engage in language research in the 1970s. At the same time, I was reading a book called A Natural History of Ghosts that covered quite a lot of material about British hauntings. There was a chapter in that book about Borley Rectory, which is said to be the most haunted house in England. The story of Borley Rectory is rather similar to the story Shirley Jackson told in The Haunting of Hill House. A paranormal investigator named Harry Price collected a number of volunteers to live in the rectory for a period of time and observe the paranormal activity. Harry Price specifically recruited people who were well off because he expected them to pay their own expenses during their investigation of Borley Rectory. This was in contrast to what had happened in the research with Nim Chimpsky, where the student volunteers from Columbia University were allowed to live in a mansion for free while they worked with their chimpanzee. And in thinking of the contrast between the two types of research, I began to think, well, what if the Nim Chimpsky study had occurred in a situation like Borley Rectory? What if the university hadn't provided a mansion for the study? What if they'd had to rent one? What if they had to rent a mansion that was run down and maybe in ill repute because of some nasty rumors? And how would the researchers respond if they began to encounter activity like what the paranormal researchers reported at Borley Rectory? Would they blame it on the chimpanzee, or would they believe that there was something else at work? The more I thought about it, the more fun it seemed, until finally I felt compelled to start writing the book.
It wouldn't let you go.
No, it wouldn't. I was trying to work on a different story at the time, and I ended up doing Smithy instead. But it was a lot of fun.
It was a lot of fun to read too, and I love that what if. That is the tale of a good author, constantly asking what if, and how many stories have been inspired by that one question and get fleshed out by that question as well.
True. It's always fun to hear what germinated a story.
Right. Now, we talked about, of course, this is Cheers Dears. We have to know what your specialty beverage is, or your preferred beverage as you write, or your signature drink. And yours is?
I prefer to drink soft drinks, and the one that I go to a lot when I'm writing is Fresca. This is a soda that was introduced in 1966. It is a grapefruit citrus soda, and it has a lot of kick to it. I don't think it has necessarily more caffeine than an ordinary cola, but it has a very brisk flavor to it, and it always perks me up when I take a sip of Fresca. So when I'm writing late at night, I'll reach for the Fresca to perk me up, or when I'm sitting at the computer with the western sun streaming in and it feels hot, I'll go for the Fresca because it's refreshing. And I think that this is a fitting beverage for Smithy. The story takes place in 1974-75, so not too long after Fresca was introduced. And I think it's possible that some of the investigators in that study might have been drinking Fresca while they were teaching Smithy sign language.
Absolutely possible. Absolutely. That's so fun. I always love to hear what is there on the desk with different authors as they write, whether it's whiskeys or coffees or Fresca. It's just so fascinating how every single one of us has our thing that has to be at the desk.
Huh?
So I have to ask, Amanda, what are some of your favorite books to read?
I've always been a great fan of horror. And in general, I read a lot of mysteries and horror, thrillers, and historical fiction, which it's hard to believe, but Smithy is technically a piece of historical fiction now. The 70s were a few decades ago. Some of the specific books that I've enjoyed, Rebecca, Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, has been my favorite since middle school. It feels like a ghost story, even though there's not really a ghost. Just the memory of Rebecca is so overwhelming and reaches into everybody's life. I enjoyed the way that the author presented that character as somebody you feel like you know without ever actually meeting. Another book that I've enjoyed or in the horror category were The Terror, Dan Simmons' book about what really happened to the Franklin expedition. I loved how he took what's basically a gap in history. We don't know what happened to these sailors. They went out to look for the Northwest Passage and they never came back. Maybe they were eaten by monsters. Maybe they fell off the earth. We don't know. And he tells us an alternate explanation of what might have happened to them. And he does it in a way that is so vivid. As I read that book, I really felt like I knew the characters. I cried when some of them died. It really impressed me that he was able to pull together all of those elements in such a memorable piece of work. Robert McCammon is an author whose books I've always enjoyed. He also writes both in horror and in history. His book, Speaks the Nightbird, is technically not a horror novel, even though it's about a witch trial in the 1690s. But he has created a very vivid world set in the late 17th century about an investigator named Matthew Corbett. So his books straddle different genres. This particular book is a mystery, a thriller, a historical novel, and perhaps also horror if you believe that the witchcraft elements might have some veracity to them. I've also really loved Richard Matheson's work, both his writing in books and his writing for the Twilight Zone. That was my favorite TV show as a kid. I gravitated toward this strange black and white series that was not like anything else I had seen. And he wrote a number of my favorite episodes, particularly A World of His Own, which is about an author who brings his characters to life through having a very vivid imagination.
Classics. Absolutely. And how many horror authors really have been inspired by the Twilight Zone series of just these beautiful little microcosm stories that exist totally separately from each other. And we're seeing that kind of with like the American Horror Story, American Horror Stories, and just those wonderful little short stories. And they're just so captivating, and they transcend time, the Twilight Zone. It doesn't matter if you're seeing it for the first time now or back then, they're just still so good.
Yes. A lot of people I see comparing their books to the Twilight Zone when they're pitching their work. My book is like the Twilight Zone, or just certain plots when you talk about It's a Good Life, or you talk about Time Enough at Last. Enough people have seen those episodes that they know exactly what you mean. The punchlines have become part of our pop culture, even for people who may not have grown up with the series. It's been parodied in popular shows like The Simpsons. The number of their Halloween Treehouse of Horror episodes were motivated by Twilight Zone episodes. So it's fun to see how those ideas get replicated over the decades and across different media.
It really is. Now, are there any challenges in your journey were there any challenges in your journey to publication? And if so, what were they and how did you overcome them?
My journey to publication was a little bit offbeat. Instead of doing the traditional process of querying a novel with a publisher, I entered a contest. My publisher held a contest in 2018 for horror and mystery novels, and eventually my book was chosen, which was a great thrill. I didn't expect to be chosen. I entered on a whim, and it worked out very well. But I think that the editors that I worked with had a different vision for what the book would be than what I had. Again, I came to the table wanting to present ambiguous, slow burn thriller, something along the lines of The Haunting of Hill House, or along the lines of a Val Lewton movie where it's not clear what's happening and a lot of it unfolds in the reader's imagination. The people that I worked with at my publishing house were looking for more overt horror. They didn't necessarily understand that I was trying to go for subtlety. I think they thought I didn't know how to write a ghost story, and they were hinting to me ways that I could make it scarier and leaning on me to build up the dark history of the house. Some people even suggested specific plots that I could incorporate into the book. So we had some long discussions about what the future Smithy would be and what the theme of Smithy would be. Eventually, we came out with a book that everybody is happy with. It's a book that is very true to my original vision, but it was a bit of a bumpy road getting my voice heard. One of the issues, I think, is that a lot of the people who enter the contest don't necessarily have a finished book, and it's not required to have a finished book for entering the contest. The way it happens is that authors present their story idea and selected chapters, and the viewing audience has the opportunity to pre-order books that they think are interesting. If you reach a certain number of pre-orders, if you crowdfund your book, essentially, then your book will get published. But I think the publisher maybe had more expectation of having more creative control, perhaps because some of the authors that they work with didn't necessarily have finished products, whereas I did have a complete manuscript for Smithy when I came to them. So we butted heads a little bit, but we came together with a book in the end that I think is a wonderful book. And I'm glad to hear when other people like it too.
Well, good for you, though, for sticking up for your story. I know it's hard, and it's a hard balance coming at it from a now publisher's perspective and also from an author's perspective. we're trying to tell the story we've had in our heart and that is true to our spirit that we've created. But at the same time, the publisher is like, but can we do this to make it slightly more marketable or what have you? But if you're a good reader, if you're an avid reader rather, and you believe in your story, fight for it. And, truly cheers to you for fighting for your story.
Well, thank you. And you raised a good point about the difficulty of balancing artistry with marketability. The publisher that I worked with brought up some points that I hadn't considered, specifically with the format of the epistolary novel. He pointed out that it would be very difficult to do an audiobook that way. Some of the entries in Smithy are fairly short, and he thought that those would be disruptive to the flow of the story. He wanted me to take out the shorter entries, even though some of them are meaningful entries. But when he pointed out it would be a problem for the audiobook, that was something that I had never considered. I don't listen to audiobooks myself, so I'm not very familiar with how they work. And he made some other points about audience expectations and about marketability that I didn't think about when I was writing the book, because I was concerned with telling a story that was in my mind. Right. So I think that publishers do make valid arguments, but coming to a compromise can be a bit of work. I personally, I think that an author should stand up for her book or her vision, but I've seen other authors who recommend that the thing to do is to make the changes and take the money and go, which is surprising to me.
Yeah, it's definitely figuring out the balance, and also what your writing goals are too, because that's going to influence what you're doing in your journey and how you get there. But that's so wonderful. What an incredible story. And not something I think all authors really realize is that there are these opportunities to enter your books in contests to get published. So that's another great thing to look into, listeners and watchers. If you're trying to find a place for your book to find a home, look into these various different competitions that do exist and are really cool. And I'll be sure to have a link to Amanda's publisher in the description box as well, so you can kind of check out what that format looks like and what that competition looks like as well.
Absolutely. And Inkshares is continuing to publish books outside of contests too. Their crowdfunding runs all year round. And a friend of mine, a fellow horror author, got his book crowdfunded about a year after I entered my contest. So he also has a book coming out with Inkshares next year, although he took a slightly different route through the same company. It is very exciting to see all the different ways that doors are opening for authors to be published, even as the traditional publishing industry is becoming more constricted and more consolidated. So there is hope. There are lots of different ways to get there.
That's right. It's just a matter of finding the right one for your story.
True.
So Amanda, we have a listener question here for you. This comes from Sal Bump, and he would like to know, what was the first story you ever wrote? And would you have any ambition of publishing it if it hasn't been published yet?
The first story I wrote, I wonder if that means stories that I wrote in first grade when we had creative writing assignments, or the first story I wrote when I was actually trying to be an author. The very first story I can remember writing was for an anthology in my first grade class. I wrote a story about a little boy who was teasing people with a squirt gun at a circus, and then a fire broke out at the circus and he used the water pistol to put it out and became the hero. Fun little story. It shows that bad behavior can be rewarded. But the first time that I set out to write a novel, it was a horror novel. It was actually inspired by a Scooby-Doo episode I had seen. I was about 11 at the time, and I set out to write a book about a cursed necklace that would turn the wearer into a panther. I got a spiral-bound notebook, 70-page notebook, and I started writing top of the page to the bottom of the page, front page and back. I just started writing, and when I got to the end, I stopped. So I had this very meandering story about a cursed necklace and a vengeful goddess who took the shape of a cat and was threatening the main character. There were a lot of different elements in it. It was fun, but I don't think it's ready to be published. It needs to be tightened up quite a bit.
But it's an interesting story, and I think that's good.
Thank you. Yes, I've dealt with quite a handful of different stories. I was trying to work on a YA series about kids investigating supernatural happenings in their small town. And I tried to write a serious novel about a young man who thought he was being followed by an ambulance full of people who were filming him for reality TV. So maybe one of these days I'll resurrect one of those plots. I've got a shoebox full of audio cassettes. Eventually I decided that handwriting my books was too hard on my wrist, and I switched to a dictaphone so I could tell my stories as they came into my mind. I have a lot of those tapes that I still need to transcribe, but maybe one of them will end up on the shelf someday as a book.
Cheers to that. That's awesome.
Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, I love that you're able to take notes through a dictaphone. I have such a hard time staying focused trying to do audio notes, and I just can't. I just get so distracted as I go. So I really appreciate that you can do that. That's really cool.
It really helped my output. Once I was no longer tied to a keyboard or tied to a pen and paper, I could just take the dictaphone with me anywhere when I'm walking to the bus stop, or if I'm sitting on the back of the bus on a long bus trip, and just speak into it. And I feel it's able to capture my thoughts more readily. If I have an idea, I can just speak it. I don't have to wait until I get home and write it down, and then I forget what I was going to say. And as I'm writing, I'm improvising a lot more. So the story is flowing faster, maybe not flowing as well. Maybe it needs a bit of editing, but I think I get through the rough draft a lot faster through those means than through typing. Although incidentally, I did most of Smithy through the keyboard, not through the dictaphone. I felt that type of book, the epistolary novel, needed to be written instead of spoken.
I throughout the book, there's different fonts used, which was I really enjoyed that, because it was what am I trying to say? It kept my attention more, almost, because each, we're so used to Adobe Garamond Pro in every single book, or whatever the standardized font is these days. And yet with your story, it went from a typewriter to a different kind of typewriter to italicized font. And it was just so much more captivating, I think, because it made me pay attention all that much more. But I could just envision, as I was reading this, somebody having to type these notes out on a keyboard of a typewriter, because I was just so into the story as I went. And it just, I think, put me into your world and in such a level that I hadn't really experienced before, not too often, because we don't really see books written with different fonts throughout the story.
It's interesting that you bring that up. I had actually had a conversation with one of my editors about choosing different handwriting fonts for different characters as they're speaking. When I was a kid, I read The Babysitter's Club, and those novels had different handwriting for each of their characters. The characters would write journals about their babysitting exploits, and you would see each character's different handwriting. I suggested we could do something similar, and she was on board with it. And then she came back a little later and said, that's going to be too distracting if we do that. So you almost got to see even more different fonts than you already have in the book. But I like that it does use different fonts for different media. I think it signals to the reader, for one thing, what's coming up. So if you're interested in reading a character's diary and you see the italicized font come up, you know that diary is coming up. You see the bold type, you know you're going to be reading a transcript of a video that took place. I think the visual shift in fonts makes it easier to recall what medium you're reading at that time. Is it a newspaper? Is it a diary? Is it a transcript? But it also sort of foreshadows what's going to be coming up, who's going to be telling the story next. And that change in perspective also changes the credibility of the story, I think. Are you more likely to believe something that was captured by videotape or captured by an author of a letter or an author of a diary? Depends on who it is that's writing the letter or the diary. Do you believe that person is a reliable witness or not?
And that's a great place to leave that. So, folks, if you want to check out Amanda's books, I will have her book. I will have it in the links below. And Amanda, please let us know what's next and where can the people find you?
I have a website called desireesbooks.com where I share information about my upcoming appearances and some behind the scenes trivia about the writing of Smithy. I hope to have more books in the future to post on the site and to share about. I'm currently brushing up an old manuscript where I'm retelling the story of King Kong from the perspective of the Islanders, and I'm hoping to be shopping that around later in the year.
I'm definitely looking forward to seeing that when it comes out. And Amanda, thank you so much for joining us here.
Oh, thank you very much. I've enjoyed chatting with you. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity.
A huge thank you to my sponsors, Sal Bomp and Don W. And to see how you can buy me a coffee, head on over to buymeacoffee.com/sfaxon.